A Song of Ice and Fire. I love A Song of Ice and Fire. I made a full video about how much I love this series, but also how loving this series can sometimes be frustrating. As of course, it has been 13 years now since the last installment. And since then, we have gotten a TV show that became one of the most popular shows of all time that phenomenally adapted the books, of course, until they ran out of books to adapt, and then, for lack of a better term, it kind of shit itself. I've talked about that already, and of course the ending of Game of Thrones really killed a lot of people's interest in it. However, they were sort of able to salvage the brand a couple of years ago with the release of House of the Dragon, a prequel series that was actually really good, and we are now just a couple days away from the premiere of its second season. And of course, one of the reasons this show is good compared to the final seasons of Game of Thrones is that it is once again actually based on something that George wrote. But this is a little bit different than the Song of Ice and Fire books, and it was actually quite a bit controversial when it first released and got a mixed reception from fans and critics. And if you would travel back to 2018 with me, it's not really hard to see why, as this is the year where, it had become the longest gap people had seen so far in the main series. While the show had not had its abysmal final season yet, it had officially veered off from the books, and, the cracks were definitely starting to show. People often, always cite Season 8 because Season 8 is so bad, but Season 7 is still definitely not a great time to be a Song of Ice and Fire fan. What would have really picked up people's spirits was Winds of Winter, but of course that didn't happen. Instead, George decided to give us Fire and Blood, which not only is it not a continuation of A Song of Ice and Fire, but it is the first of a 2-volume series that details the history of the Targaryen reign in Westeros, which was stuff we already knew about. So yeah, while I was a show watcher far before I was a book reader, I can definitely understand why people were frustrated by this release, especially because it's not even a normal novel in the traditional sense. All of the other books follow, this wide cast of characters through their eyes as we watch this vast story unfold, and you could say most fantasy books are like that as well. But Fire and Blood is essentially 700 pages of an old guy compiling a bunch of sources to give us a history lesson on Westeros. Yeah, it's basically an old-timey history textbook, which starts 300 years before the main series during Aegon's conquest, of course when the Targaryens first gained control of Westeros, and covers about 130 years from that point up to the big Targaryen Civil War, which is of course the basis for the House of the Dragon show. Now, I knew all of this about Fire and Blood ever since it came out, and to be honest, it didn't really interest me, and I don't think it interested a lot of fans either. Because, while this was a big bestseller, it's not a book a lot of Song of Ice and Fire fans are really talking about. But of course, I just love this series so much that I wanted more, so now that I'm out of main series books to read, I decided to check it out. And I have to say, I was quite surprised in what I discovered about this book. Mostly the fact that it was fantastic. Now, right off the bat, I should say, if what I said to you doesn't interest you in the slightest, and even if you read, say, the first chapter of Fire of Blood, and you're not into it, not into the way it's told, you will not like Fire and Blood. This is a very, very dry book. As I said, it's essentially an old maester guy just telling you events. And he goes very in depth on a lot of this stuff, talks about his sources, talks about, historical context of all of this stuff. We learn all about the Targaryen family tree, what, their lives were like, all the stuff they got up to. But it is all very much from an outsider's perspective. While in the main series, we are front and center in these people's lives, in this one, you really feel like you are a bystander in this world. Because of that, there is almost no characterization to be had. When I say it's kind of like a history book, I really mean it. We hear about all of these big events like we hear about big events in our own world. We don't learn what the characters were feeling internally. We don't necessarily know all of the struggles that they face. And we don't always even know the whole truth of the situation. This being written like an in-universe account of all of the history, certain events are either glossed over because there isn't enough information. Sometimes they're only relying on a few witnesses and don't actually know the whole truth. A lot of times they can only speculate on what really happened here. It really is just pure lore for 700 pages. It doesn't have the witty dialogue you've come to expect, doesn't have the character arcs you come to expect, and that is a huge turnoff for a lot of people, and I get it. It would be a huge turnoff for me if this were, not presented the way it was. But because it is presented the way it is, as, purely Targaryen history, I thought that the events in this book were pretty phenomenal. This is still George R.R. Martin we're talking about. He has created one of the most rich and expansive, fantasy worlds of all time. And Fire and Blood is him basically just flexing on everyone. That yeah, my history's like this. What are you gonna do about it? From Aegon the Conqueror, this story spans decades, following all the different kings and queens of Westeros, all of the conflicts they face with other nations within their own house when it comes to succession. It's all of the stuff you know and love about the series, just presented in a very different way. I found the way it was told to be very intriguing, how we often don't know the real history, like there could be some details missing. It all felt very authentic and believable as sort of an in-universe recount of the history. And some of the stories of these old monarchs were so engaging too. Even if we weren't really connecting to them on an emotional level, there's still just some really fantastic stuff in here. Great displays of storytelling from George. I guess while we did know a lot of the Targaryen history from the main series, it was never this in-depth. I was pretty much engaged the entire way through. I was kind of worried that this book would feel like a slog, but it does have a lot of years to cover, so it actually does move pretty quickly. The book is kind of split into two parts, actually, where, it starts with Aegon's conquest, then goes all the way to the Civil War, but the Civil War is like the entire second half of the book. And this is partially because, of course, the Civil War is, probably the most interesting thing that happened in this time in Westeros, but also because in the universe, they just have more details on the Civil War because it was a much bigger event. There were more witnesses. And yeah, the story of the Targaryen Civil War is absolutely incredible, man. Even though we still don't have that level of characterization here, there's still so much you can sort of interpret from these historical figures, and you can sort of still understand what all of their mindsets were as we get into this crazy bloody war of succession. It's now very obvious to me why they wanted to turn this into a show and how they have enough material to turn it into a show. And I actually think my enjoyment of this part of the story was really helped by the show, because through the show I, am emotionally attached to these characters. So when big events were happening, I was having these crazy reactions to them that I might not have had if I had not seen the show. But even without the show, the stuff here is so good. There are truly some epic moments that I was not expecting from this book. Gotta give props to my boy Mushroom, who is one of the main witnesses that that they use as a source in this book. This dude was just chilling, but he ended up seeing almost the entire war, so good for him. And I do think it was really smart focusing so much on the Civil War, because it does really feel like the book keeps building to this big climax, and the climax really delivers. That being said, I do think it ends up overstaying its welcome a bit, because after the Civil War, it still goes on for a bit longer, and I understand why. I just think that this part of the story kind of pales in comparison and feels a lot more mundane, and the very ending, I'm okay, I guess. I feel like this part would have probably served better for, an introduction into the next volume. Will we ever get that? I don't know, but yeah, you know what I mean. So yeah, overall, I was kind of shocked by Fire and Blood. I did not expect to enjoy it as much as I did. I definitely do not think this book will be for everyone. Like I said, if you start reading this book and you're not into it, you're just not going to like it at all. But if you have been writing this book off and haven't even checked it out, I definitely think it's worth at least giving a look, because as a big fan of the series, I wasn't expecting much either, but I ended up really loving it. And also the added benefit of, knowing what's going to happen in House of the Dragon, and Holy Mother of Christ, I ain't ready to see some of that, man. I don't know. Yeah, I ended up giving this one 4.5 stars. I'd probably still rank it below all of the books in the main series, just because, it doesn't have those elements of characterization that really push the other one over the top. But the story here is so strong, the history feels so authentic. I really, really love this one, and if part 2 does come out before the Winds of Winter, while I will still be upset and frustrated along with everyone else, I would also be very excited for more Targaryen history and definitely read it day one. I just want to say, I am so grateful that there is all of this great expanded content that George wrote for A Song of Ice and Fire. Do I wish he would have spent more time on the main series? Yes, absolutely, don't get me wrong. But you know, HBO was going to make a million spin-offs anyway, so I'm glad they actually have good stuff to pull from, so we aren't getting like Jon Snow from the Book of Tyrion, a Game of Thrones tale. Because like, you know, that's exactly where we would be right now if we didn't have, you know, the Hedge Knight novellas, all of the content from Fire and Blood. I mean, they have dozens of seasons of content just based on stuff George wrote. What I'm saying is, if they're going to turn it into a cash cow money farm anyway, it's all stuff that has the potential to be really good. And yes, I'm still hopeful that one day we do get at least Winds of Winter. Please God. Let's just get over that line first before we make any speculation on what comes next. So anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Leave your thoughts on anything Song of Ice and Fire in the comments down below. Let me know if you are going to be checking out House of the Dragon Season 2. I'm very excited for it. We'll be watching it every Sunday night as soon as it drops. Next video will probably be a long overdue look at some manga I have been reading, so I will see you all then.